Hello class, today we will be discussing propaganda in the mass media, which fits into our overall unit on the citizen's role in a democratic society. Now, in understanding the purpose of mass media, I think it's important to understand what exactly is considered mass media. By definition, it includes all means for communicating information to the general public. Now notice that this is a fairly neutral statement, not clarifying what type of information is being given. Often in nominally democratic societies, one would note that the purpose of such an institution would be to hold power to account, to speak truth to power, or to be the watchdog of power. Before discussing what propaganda is exactly, I think it's important to understand the different types of media outlets. Now, we have private and publicly funded media outlets. So privately funded media outlets are run by corporations, which run by making money as opposed to being publicly funded outlets, which rely on government funding to produce their media. Some examples of private media outlets are CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, or Fox News. Examples of publicly funded media outlets are the BBC out of Britain, RT in Russia, or Al Jazeera out of Qatar. Now, critics of privately run media institutions would say that they are corrupted by the influence of profit, while critics of publicly funded outlets would purport that because they rely on government funding, they're more likely to conform to the interests of the state, which produce their funding. Another thing to note before moving on, I find it important to note about a certain caveat of privately run mass media, especially in the US, and that's the consolidation of media. As of right now, 90% of privately run media is controlled by a total of 6 mass media conglomerates, meaning that though there appear to be a number of news outlets to get your news from and attaining information, overwhelming majority of those outlets are produced by only a handful of corporations, those most notably being 21st Century Fox, Time Warner, Comcast, Sony, Viacom, and Disney. Now on to what propaganda actually is by definition. Now, propaganda is considered by definition using ideas, information, or rumors to influence opinion. Though in American society, we often associate media propaganda with authoritarian governments, which use their concentrated power to push ideas onto its citizenry, many would consider society within nominally democratic nation states to be influenced by propaganda also. Two of the most seminal works in understanding propaganda in the mass media in democratic societies are Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion, 1922, in which he discusses mass media as a tool of social coercion in influencing its audience what to think and what to see by controlling that frame, and Edward Bernays' 1928 book, Propaganda, in which he explores the psychological aspects of propaganda through the mass media. Renowned linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky and his colleague Edward S. Herman wrote Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media in 1988, in which they presented their idea of the propaganda model. Now, the propaganda model is a system of 5 filters through which the mass media produce news. In order to test their theory of the propaganda model, the authors presented multiple case studies in which they tested their idea of the propaganda model, and it held true. In this video you are about to watch, it explains each of the 5 steps, or also known as the 5 filters of the propaganda model. Now, adding on to what you've just seen, in 2019, Matt Taibbi wrote a contemporary criticism of the mass media in his book, Hate Inc. This book seeks to understand the hyperpartisan nature of today's mass media. Having been influenced by Chomsky and Herman's 1988 work, Taibbi attempts to understand how, since the publication of Manufacturing Consent, the mass media has shifted away from the propaganda model more into a model in which they sow fear and anger into their audiences as a means of keeping their attention in order to retain the viewership, which makes them money. Though we covered a good bit in today's lesson, these are some of the topics you may want to review for the quiz on this lesson: the definition of mass media, the difference between private and publicly funded mass media, aspects of media consolidation, the definition of propaganda, and the 5 steps of the propaganda model. Thanks.
Propaganda. Many use the word when talking about countries like North Korea, Kazakhstan, Iran. Countries viewed as authoritarian